I will start with this overview of icao and easa work. But first, maybe for those less acquainted with icao, a short description. This graph here is not the structure of icao, only part of icao, the part concerning CAPE. CAEP. I will come back on this. ICAO is the International Civil Aviation Organization. It is a United Nations agency in charge of building certification standards and guidelines for aviation worldwide, mainly regarding safety and operation like air traffic management, which is ATM. It has a committee called CAEP, Committee on Aviation Environmental Protection. Within the CAPE, several working groups are in charge of proposing new standards or guidelines on good practice to be adopted by ICAO, and which will be applicable or used by its members. Certification standards are the minimum to be applied worldwide, but can be improved locally. Guidelines are not compulsory, only the description of good practice. The CAPE has 3-year cycles, so it meets every 3 years, and decisions are taken at the end of each 3-year cycle. The process then takes time. Often 2 or more cycles are necessary before a standard is adopted. CAPE members are state representatives having signed the ICAO Convention of 1945, but meetings are also open to observers. These are mainly states which have not signed the ICAO Convention and the aviation industry representatives. Of course, aircraft and engine manufacturers, but also airports associations like ACI, like aircraft carriers organization like IATA, pilot association like IFALPA, and Tim Johnson, who will speak later today, realized years ago that communities should be represented in the working group as well. As his organization was British and not international, we had to put up a coalition. He had to put up a coalition, including environmental organizations from different countries and continents. This is how ICSA, ICSA, the International Coalition for Sustainable Aviation, was set up, and is now the only NGO representing civil society as an observer in CAPE working groups. ICSA includes the UK AEF, Aviation Environment Federation, where Tim Johnson is director, Carbon Market Watch, EDF, the Environmental Defense Fund, the ICCT, International Council for Clean Transportation, Transport and Environment, the European NGO, and the World Wildlife Fund. They are all very focused on aviation emissions of pollutants and climate impact of aviation. Although UECNA is not a member of ICSA, they accepted to propose my name for 2 working groups, Noise Technical and Airports and Operation. And if you look at this slide here, you will see all the working groups, some of which you will have heard of, like CORSIA, Working Group 4, or the Working Group 3, working on emissions, a very important group, which is LTAG Working Task Group, which works on long-term goals, and Working Group 1 on noise, Working Group 2 on airports and operation, where I work. ICAO is industry driven. Its purpose is to ensure that an aircraft built in a country will be able to fly all over the world. As aviation realized that it had an environmental adverse impact, it was pushed to reduce its impact by member states, by NGOs. You will have heard about Annex 16, Volume 1 of ICAO Convention. This is the one dealing with noise stringencies. We are now for subsonic commercial aircraft at chapter 14, stringency. The work of Working Group 1 is to maintain and improve the noise certification standards. This is for commercial aviation, for helicopters, and light aviation, business jets. Regarding the work of Working Group 2, it does not build certification standards, but you will have heard of PBN, precision-based navigation, of CDO, continuous descent operation, or CCO, continuous climb operation, for instance. Its aim is to look at good practice, like how should an aircraft be flying to reduce the consumption of jet fuel, how to reduce the emission of pollutants or reduce noise. Now, the main subject at present being discussed in these two working groups. Working Group 1 on noise. There's a very important subject, which is the dual stringency standards. It will be for noise and CO2 emissions, and it is a joint work of Working Group 1 on noise and Working Group 3 on emissions. So when ICAO works on new stringency, we need not be too excited. It is not to fix a goal for later, but only to evaluate the state of the technology of a global fleet existing or in project, and push the noise limits to what the industry is capable of.
What I suggest is you go out again, try and join again.
John, if you could unmute, please. If you could mute your microphone.
Yeah.
The innovation here is that in this dual stringency standard is that the fleet will have to pass two stringencies, one regarding noise and the second for CO2. The concern for communities around airports, encroachment is the technical ugly word, is that technologies which will improve the impact on the climate may not be good for noise reduction. And I would suggest on that matter that if you missed it, you listen to our webinar number 7 on can new aircraft be designed to cut emissions and noise with Finlay Asher as a speaker. It was very interesting. So we are in a very early process of this dual stringency standards, and it will take a few years before we reach an agreement on new standards. The second subject, very hot today, is ETA, Emerging Technology Aircraft Noise. Emerging technology covers mostly drones and flying taxis. This is an important work as the number of movement of drone expected in the future would reach 4 billion a year globally. The smaller drones with no required certifications to the larger drones which will need to be certified. We need to be present on this subject and inform our city representatives of the risk of adding noise in the environment. On the subject, I would like to refer you to our webinar, and there is a link of the recording on our website. We really need to work on drones and flying taxis. They will invade our space in cities. Supersonic aircraft has been very hot, and it's still a strong discussion, although despite the disappearance of projects like Ariane and Boom remaining the sole project, but possibly today with no engine. It would appear that the manufacturer building the engine decided to leave the project. For supersonic aircraft, there will be two standards. One for LTO, landing and takeoff noise, which would have the same limits as for subsonic aircraft. That means Chapter 14 limits. It is important because there was discussions for a long time where the stringency would be more relaxed than the Chapter 14 limits. And the other standard will be for en route noise, as supersonic transport means sonic boom. And this sonic boom follows the aircraft on the whole past flight when the aircraft is over the sound speed. The US NASA is working on a project where the sonic boom could be reduced to a thump. But it's also a long-run project with a demonstration being built at present, which would be able to fly next year with community response tests in the US over next year and the year after. I suspect that you will understand that the work of Working Group 1 is very important as it directly impacts on the communities. And we need to have a professional representation there. We will discuss this maybe in the way forward at the end of this conference, as I believe that only a global coalition financed by all the citizens could allow this to happen. As for Working Group 2, there are also direct impacts on the communities. As I mentioned earlier, PBN, performance-based navigation work, or CDO, a continuous descent operation. Today, current work includes noise monitoring best practice, for instance, which is important because you may not realize in Europe we have noise monitoring almost everywhere, but in many countries at many airports there is no noise monitoring at all, or when there is, it is not very efficient or not used to help communities. So it is important that best practice on noise monitoring are shared globally. There's work on community engagement, which is really a popular word today, community engagement, as airports think that community engagement will help acceptance of airport traffic. There is community engagement work on PBN, for instance, or ATM change. ATM meaning air traffic management. There's work on climate and adaptation, and here it may not be what you think. Climate adaptation is for airports. What will happen to the airport when the runways will be flooded with the rise of the level of the sea? Well, airports need to adapt as well to climate change. Like operation with hot temperatures, it is not the same as operating in cold temperature. So climate adaptation is really adapting airport and air carriers so that the activities is not disrupted by climate change. Operational opportunities to reduce non-CO2 effects on climate change. This is led by pilots and like the environmental independencies in operating scenarios. And the aim is to see how to balance fuel consumption and reduction of noise, or fight climate climate impacts like CO2 emissions against NOx emissions. And the final mention here, Eco Airport Toolkit e-collection is a collection of guidelines on various matters, generally a good practice. So I think I will not extend too much on this and speak very quickly about EASA work. EASA is the European Aviation Safety Agency. It is the equivalent of the US FAA, Federal Aviation Agency. EASA participates in the work of icao as an observer, and really the work of EASA is a certification work. This is the main objective, meaning that whenever an aircraft is willing to operate in Europe, it will need to be certified by the EASA on top of other certification it may have had in other countries, although there are simplified procedures when an aircraft has been already certified in the US, for instance. So the EASA is very concerned by the same subjects as those on which icao is working, for instance, supersonic flights, or also UAM, which is urban air mobility, and VTOL, vertical takeoff landing devices, as this is very hot, as I said, in the moment. EASA says, declares itself, it's willing to protect the communities around airports, and this is surely true for some of departments, but really they are here to enable air transport, to facilitate aviation development. EASA advises DG Move on aviation matters, and they issue regulations or rules recently on supersonic LTO, landing takeoff noise, and UAM, and we commented on them as UECNA. And this is what we need to follow because it will be directly enforceable in our European countries.